Good evening, good morning, I think maybe to a few people, and welcome to the what we have called traditionally the New York HR Analytics Meetup, although obviously for the past 18 months or so it has been the theoretical New York HR, non-theoretical analytics meetup. There are many meetups going on at 6 p.m., so hopefully you have entered the right Zoom link. Too, if you're looking for, a recreational yoga is probably on another link. My name is Jeremy Shapiro, and I get to lead the workforce analytics team at Merck Pharmaceuticals. And along with our co-organizers, Estelle Lupushur, Miriam is here as well. We haven't seen him in a while, with Bennett Voorhees. Welcome to this group. So for many of you that are new to this group, our job is to connect the wonderful talent that we have all around the world in the analytics and HR community to further our own knowledge and really understand more deeply how to improve organizations and to make better choices day to day for leaders. We hold events about 5 or 6 times a year. On the call right now, we have a wonderful mix of practitioners, a wonderful mix of thought leaders in the space, some folks that have been doing this work for just a few months, some of which have been doing this work for decades. And it's a great and open forum for all of us to learn and grow. So here's how the session will operate today. First, we are going to welcome Jody Starkman, who was so instrumental in helping us to bring Rob Cross to the stage today. And then we're gonna hand the mic over to Bennett Voorhees to facilitate a conversation with multiple author and the current co-author of this month's cover HBR story, as well as a new book, which we're going to talk about in a moment. We will towards the end of the session be giving away some of Rob's books. He did not ask us to do this. We wanted to make sure that you got access to some of this great thinking as well, and certainly timely thinking too. So with that, let me just pull up to the stage Jody Starkman. And just as a brief introduction, Jody is the executive director for the Innovation Resource Center for Human Resources. Prior to that, Jody was the EVP and COO for global consulting at ORC Worldwide, which is now owned by Mercer. And Jody's connection to Rob is through sponsorship and the furthering of organizational network analysis as a discipline too. And so really welcome, really excited to have you, Jody, to come and say hi and meet this analytics team that spends their time. This is what we do for fun, Jody. I'm just saying, you're seeing it.
Thank you so much, Jeremy. And thank you to your fellow hosts of this very impressive community for the opportunity to be here, to share a little bit about my organization, and to always appreciate the opportunity to learn from the insightful and compelling research of Rob Cross, which is always a treat. In fact, today was a double dose for me, as I also heard Rob present earlier today at MIT Sloan Management Review's 2-hour event, which focused on navigating the workplace revolution. So as Jeremy said, I'm the executive director of Innovation Resource Center for Human Resources, also known as IRC for HR. We're a private research foundation. Our official charitable mission, which was established in 1926, yes, that's 95 years ago, is to advance the knowledge and practice of human relations in the workplace. And what this means in practice is that we fund research to enhance the success of companies and the lives of workers through better HR and management practices. In our earlier years, or very early years, we were involved in the development of big policy and program things, like creating the concept of unemployment insurance and designing the US Social Security system. We also conducted research inside companies and produced reports and recommendations that looked a lot like today's business consulting assignments. In more recent years, we've been funding research focused on the implications of a rapidly changing digital world. And this has included new designs for organizations, identifying new sets of digital leadership capabilities, accelerating the evolution of the HR function, and helping workers thrive through change, all with the goal of creating a more just and inclusive economy. The fact that your meetup description includes the statement, deeply caring about making both people and enterprises thrive, says a lot to me about this group's co-founders and also the people on the call. And it tells me that we have a lot in common, which I find very encouraging. I'm always in search of kindred spirits whose work and purpose are aligned with mine and with the mission of IRC for HR. Another important aspect of our funding strategy is that we provide grants for what I call pracademic research. This refers to studies that are robust in terms of methodology and analysis, but still practical in terms of producing actionable applied insights. In other words, we generally don't fund research that lands in academic journals that only other academics read. And for the past 4 years, we have provided funding for multiple studies by Rob Cross. I think it's fair to say that no grantee whose work we have funded exemplifies the kinds of research we care about, that is, helping organizations and workers thrive and generating practical insights and tools than Rob. From the powerful insights into patterns of work, collaboration, and silos that are generated by organizational network analysis, to the emerging body of knowledge about how personal networks drive individual and team performance, to understanding the impact of relationships on our well-being in the workplace and in life. The grants we have made to Rob during the past 4 years have yielded invaluable lessons and tools for organizations, for leaders, for teams, and for individuals. I am sure you will see elements of all of those in this presentation that he will be sharing with you, and more, because we haven't funded all of his research, just some. Anyway, to me, those are illustrations of what many of you do. It's about the power of data to tell a story that gets people to make better decisions, to modify their behavior, to improve their performance, and working together to imagine and co-create new possibilities. I want to wrap up this little intro about me and IRC for HR and about our funding of Rob's research by saying that I think we are all witnessing a unique set of dynamics that are playing out in our economy, our companies, and our lives. It's got many names and you see them in the headlines every day, but whatever you want to refer to it as, it feels to me like one of those moments in history when real change is both in demand and also possible. And I invite all of you to continue doing the work you do to create that more just and inclusive economy where organizations and people do indeed thrive. And one last thing, Stella said I could include a call to action, so here it is. I would ask that you please follow IRC for HR and me on LinkedIn to learn about our research, but just as importantly, to share your thoughts about research topics you would like to see explored, to suggest multi-stakeholder conversations we need to be having, and to share any thoughts you have about how to leverage what seems to me like a once-in-a-generation opportunity to put people and human relations at the center of work. So thank you, and Bennett, handing it off to you.
Thanks, Jody. I have a tough act to follow after that introduction, but I have a couple of honors to also recognize. I'm Bennett. I have the honor of leading the data science team within workforce analytics at Merck Pharmaceuticals, working with Jeremy and many folks on the call. I also have the honor of introducing tonight Rob Cross. He's a mentor, a colleague, and most importantly, a colleague in this space. And Rob is a professor at Babson College. Currently the Edward A. Madison Professor of Global Leadership there, previously at the University of Virginia, and over the course of 20 years has worked with over 300 organizations on implementing network science into companies. And so I'm going to paste into the chat one of the first most important pieces of work that has come out on this month's cover of Harvard Business Review on well-being, on succeeding quickly in a new role. So Rob also manages a research consortium called the Connected Commons, where managing a critical career transition, which is the topic of this month's Harvard Business Review cover piece, is widely researched in that consortium, driving innovation through networks, creating agility through networks, as well as managing collaborative overload, which is a big topic of today's discussion. And for, as Jeremy mentioned, the prize of the evening will be Beyond Collaboration Overload, Rob's new book, based on over a decade of research studying how successful people and how they collaborate. And something that's we're starting to realize is really important, especially during our transition to a hybrid working model or a fully remote working model, depending on what company you're working on. And what I love about Rob's research, both in this work and then just in general, is, especially as Jody was saying, academic research, was that he shows kind of how the rubber hits the road in research. For example, showing us in his work how we can all take actions to reclaim 18 to 24% of our time to be better efficient in how we collaborate with our peers, and then also focus on our own well-being, which we know is super important, especially now 2 years going into the pandemic. As much as I don't like saying that, Rob really gives us some practical advice on using our networks for well-being and cutting down on collaboration overload. So again, I am very privileged to introduce Rob, and I will turn the floor over to him.
All right. Well, thank you so much. I think we should just all call it a night and go home after those kind of words. So it's a treat to be here with everybody. And I made a direction in terms of going down this path and talking a little bit, obviously, about the book and things that we focus there, but to spend a little bit less time on analytics and more on the actionable insights and the implications of that. But I'm very happy to pivot in whatever direction people most need to hear from me. We are, per Jeremy, now going to do a little recreational yoga. There'll be a couple of midpoints in here that I've built out for that too, because I'm trying to be agile myself. But I would just urge people to put into the chat or the Q&A any thoughts that hit you for us to come back to later on the analytics side, if people want to go down that route, whether it's passive data, active, whatever you want to kind of think about. I would love to delve into that. But for me, just to level set, this is one of the oldest slides of humankind. I've used this thing forever at this point to just make sure people are on the same page with me. I never know. Some people have been thinking about network analytics for a decade and a half with me, and some people are, what are these lines? And so I always just try to orient a little bit into this. But for me, it's just a way of assessing patterns of connectivity, right? And again, with a crowd like this, there's 1,000 ways we can do it, right? There's all sorts of passive analytics that are emerging that we can leverage. There's also very rapid active-based tools that we built in the consortia that have really taken off like crazy, particularly in more targeted uses and groups kind of ranging in maybe the 30 to 500-600 person range, some really rapid analytics on that level. But what it just enables us to do is just get a sense of, as hierarchy in most organizations over the past 15 years, the role of, the decision hierarchy at least has started to minimize, right? And we've gone all through these things, from matrix-based designs to spans and layers to agile to everything else. It's pushed work and the coordination of work more into the networks, and simultaneously, we've had all these seemingly cheap technologies pour through the landscape that is making connectivity really even more rapid and people kind of always on in different ways. And so it makes being able to see these network patterns increasingly important to understand how work is getting done, how people are engaging in their organizations or not, a range of really critical things like that. And so for me, when I'm looking at it, I'm always interested very pragmatically on typically we see 3 to 5% of the people account for 20 to 35% of the value-added collaborations in most places. There's of course never just one Mitchell, right? If I'm looking at a group of 20 or 30,000, there are going to be thousands of them distributed through the group. And what I'm always interested in with just these two kinds of people are who's overwhelmed, right? Where have the collaborative demands risen above our human capacity to keep up, because we don't factor that into role design anymore. We don't think about that in these inclusive cultures and everything else. We just kind of pour more and more on people. And then number two, where are we missing talent? So we oftentimes find that if I compare my list of the Mitchells of the world against the company's list, there's less than a 50% overlap, right? And so either case, you really care about that as we move into 2022 and the looming resignations predicted, right? Because if Mitchell leaves for either one of those reasons, it's more than just what they know that walks out the door, right? It's the way they're enabling that group to be successful in different ways. Just as interested on the fringe and the article that both Jeremy and Bennett were referring to, that's a completely separate track of work we've had going in the consortia for really over a decade now, that has had about 50 companies deeply involved in it. And at the heart of it, what we could see early on in those analytics is it would take people coming into places like, I won't mention names, but companies on this call, it would take them 3 to 5 years to replicate the connectivity of a high performer. It didn't mean they weren't talking to people. It meant they hadn't built the same bridging ties and reputational capital and trust that enabled some people to get greater scale and deliver bigger outcomes than others, right? 3 to 5 years to do that, but I could see that about 10% of the population would do it in about 9 months. And so I got super interested, right, in understanding what are they doing on entry, and then how do we think about that? Initially, it was onboarding, right, and we found a lot of little subtle things, right? So, for example, the first 90 days work, and I'm not criticizing it because it was perfect for a time, but first 90 days work says come in, build your brand, put some points on the board, tell your story, right? So it's all about you as an individual and what you've done before coming into the system. And what we're finding is that's not working that well, right? What we would find with these fast movers is they would come in, but rather than tell their story, they would spend a lot of time asking questions, morph their expertise to the incumbent's needs, give status, generate energy, and create a mutual win. And so the people that did that, they weren't kind of sitting down and saying, here's what I've done before, right? When they were asked, they would pivot that question back and say, I can tell you about my background in a second, but help me understand your pain points, the primary things you're focused on. And then they would position that expertise to the incumbent's needs. And these people get pulled in, right? Suddenly they're riding on the trust of the established people. All sorts of things happen to them. They're engaged in about a third of the time, right? That it takes the traditional kind of more selling mentality, not from an arrogant standpoint, right? People are just doing what they've been taught. But we learned a ton of things that these people do over the first 9 months that really rapidly streamlines entry, and that you can build in terms of nudges and feedback to people. At first it was on entry, but now it's on more agile ways of working. And that's a little bit of what that article is geared on. And then, third is just where we see silos, right? Breakdowns. And I'm never, coming back to an organization and saying you need everybody connected to everybody else because we're all overwhelmed, right? But what I am typically seeing are very select breakdowns where silos have accrued in a way that are undermining innovation or undermining an ability to get scale, right? And then it starts to be a very targeted set of connections that bring those people together. And what we've seen in a lot of places, not all, which is intriguing to me, but in more places than not, when they're mapping that passive analytics, it's these bridging ties that have begun to erode. And again, not every case, which is kind of intriguing. I would say about 10% of the people or organizations don't seem to be seeing this. But what we know is that those are really core to innovation, right? So as we think about, where we might be experiencing some of the downfalls of COVID in this way of working, it probably won't materialize for another 12 to 18 months. But it's going to be, something that at least a lot of the members of the consortium are thinking about. So what the basis of the book is doing is then just taking these network analytics, and again, there's a ton of depth, right, in terms of what we're doing or what we may be mapping, and trying to understand over 300 organizations we've done this with, over 1,000 times I've run these analytics, where I also got separate performance data from the organizations, right? So that may be HR ratings, it may be revenue production, it may be patent counts, it could be any number of things, right? That gave me some objective measure of who the high performers were. And that's what I was interested in looking at, right? Is saying not the assumption that having a big network is a good one, but rather if we really look at who the high performers are, the people that get and stay in the upwardly mobile category, really trying to understand what they were doing, right? In terms of how they were collaborating. And when we saw this, what was intriguing is, number one, it's never, very, very rarely a big network. Only in very transactional work like residential real estate sales or things like that does purely the size of the network kind of systematically pay off. But rather that the more efficient collaborators were first distinguished by the higher performers were first distinguished by the efficiency of their networks, right? So we could plot these analytics and look to see who are the people that are giving the greatest impact and taking the least amount of time, right, in these networks. And I call these people my efficient collaborators, right? And I went out and called them up. You imagine that, right? You identified through one of these analytics as the most efficient collaborator, and the first thing you get is a 90-minute call with a flaky academic trying to understand, what you're doing there. And what we learned in that, so I started with 100 women, 100 men, and then rolled that out into a series of diagnostics that have been open. We've had over 100,000 people come through and take these. And so as a strategy of thinking about how do you move from an analytic insight to a set of qualitative understandings of how people are doing things differently, to then further validating and understanding, gosh, how are men and women differently, or what are millennials doing? It's been a whole trajectory of work, right, over quite some time. But what we saw is that the more efficient collaborators, they tended to be about 18 to 24% more efficient than their peers, the average peer. So if you think about it, that's pretty close to a day a week that these people were clawing back, and they were doing it on the small things. Right. And this is one really big idea that I'd seed with people is a lot of times when we think about the thing that's killing us, right, the thing we want to delegate, our minds work in a way that just focuses on the one or two big things, right? The obnoxious client or the demanding boss or whatever it may be. And half the time those problems are so intractable, we can't do much about it, or we can only, delegate it to the next most busy person. What we were finding with these people is that they tended to do things on the margin. They tend to be really persistent on the smaller items, and that accumulated right over time. And it was how they put structure into their work. They were more likely to strategically calendar Friday night or Sunday night with a 1 week and 3 month interval in mind, more likely to block reflective time, more likely to manage to a rhythm of work and put structure into work in ways that enabled them to be more successful right over time. Number two, they were much more attuned to what I'm going to call beliefs or identity triggers, or just our tendency, quite frankly, to jump in when we shouldn't. And if there was one thing that surprised me in all of this, it's that. Like I had assumed the overload issue was emails, time zones, nasty bosses, demanding clients, right? All external to us. And I came out the other end of all these interviews completely convinced that 50% or more of the problem are these deep triggers we all have to jump when we shouldn't. And I'll kind of go into that a little bit more in some of the specific triggers we see in here. And then third is just behaviorally, right? We find that the more efficient collaborators, they're really dogmatic again on the items they can control. So as an example of that, you'd hear some people say, well, I can't control all of email, so I'm not even going to try, right? That's not the elegant solution. Whereas the efficient collaborators would come in and say, my team generates 40%, right, of what I deal with, and we can significantly change norms of how we're using it, when we're using it, bullet points instead of 10 paragraph emails where you hide what you want in the ninth. I mean, all these subtle things that consume a tremendous amount of time, we can influence that, right? So I'll take that 5-6% of time by thinking about what are the norms around how we're working together. So that's the first piece, and I'll walk through some things. I'm gonna do a little bit of polling in here and just get a few kind of thoughts and reactions if we're able to pull this all off. But then equally importantly to me, and this is, big arguments I would have with the publisher and everything else around, I didn't just want to kind of be focused on how do you buy time back, right? That's what people really wanted to see in this, because if we do that, the tendency is just to go and do the same things we've been doing before and not really get scale, right, in how we're doing it. We've seen that through the pandemic, right? In general, if we had 8 one-hour meetings before the pandemic and we were complaining about how busy we were, now our really great insight is to say, let's have shorter meetings and more of them in the same day, right? So now we have 16 30-minute meetings and we're more exhausted because it's intense in the meetings, we're switching across them more, and we end the day with a to-do list based on 16 things versus 8. And it's like, well, no wonder, right? We're all kind of burned out and tired. What we needed to understand is what's unique about how these people are collaborating in a way that lets them scale and get different innovation impact and scale. And so that's a little bit of what I want to spend some time on the right side with y'all about. But I want to start with a story, and you're going to hear me as I went through this journey. I spent the first 15, 16 years deeply in the quantitative analytics. I'm happy to go there, but I will say the biggest and most important decision I've made in my life was to start doing a couple hundred interviews a year and really understand the stories and the richness and other things like that behind this. And so Scott's kind of a lead story in the book, and it's somebody that came into one of the life sciences organizations, was not a rock star at first, but in the first 4 or 5 years, but then was put on a new product development initiative. And because of that win and subsequent wins, he flew up the hierarchy, right? Until when I came in contact with him, he was running a group of about 1,800 people and 2 other groups of similar size. Now, we had been brought in, myself and a couple of people on my team, to look at the top 10,000, right? So we were mapping information flow interactions, decision-making interactions, and a couple of other things to see how they could speed time to market, right? And so this was a place that had done all sorts of things with formal structure to try and speed time to market, but they were finding that culture was beating structure, right? People didn't take an answer they didn't like, they just found somebody that told them what they wanted to hear. And so all the structural solutions just weren't delivering in many ways. And they were using the network analytics to see differently, where are these pinch points happening? What can we understand on that front? So I'd been in this organization, I heard nothing but, glowing things about Scott, right? When I was down there a couple of times. And he was presumed to be the next heir apparent, to the CEO spot or one of the leading contenders. And so you got to imagine my surprise when I was walking with the CEO to go into the boardroom and to talk about speeding time to market. He pulled me aside and he said, I'd like to have you look at Scott, like to pull his network out and see kind of how he's connected. And he said, because we're about to have to pull him out of his role. And he said, it's a complete mystery to us because he's come into this role. He's doing everything that we see he should be from the outside. He took layers out of the hierarchy, hugely servant-based mindset to leadership, well regarded, throughout his whole career here. And yet he's missing growth strategies in Asia. His peers are grumbling about him. The engagement scores in his groups are plummeting. All the performance metrics just don't match up with what we're seeing. And he said, could it be how he's collaborating, right? So when we looked at that, we found that in this one group, this 1,800 people, he had 118 people coming to him frequently for information, another 78 that said, if I don't get more of his time, I can't hit my business goals. And this was one of 3 groups, right, that he was running. And so when I met him, I got emails at 3 a.m. and 6 a.m. I met him, and physically you could say this person's not too happy with life, right? Not looking great. And yet he was a great guy. Right? And this is the crazy thing. When I see people that are overloaded in these networks, and we can see it quantitatively, right? I'm happy to kind of delve down into that. It's both the volume and the diversity of the demands, the switching costs that really matter. The knee-jerk reaction is, oh, they need to delegate, right? They're controlling too much. And I would say that's maybe 10% of the problem of people that really falter in this. There's all sorts of other things that get him in trouble. And for Scott, he had this deep servant-based mindset to leadership. Like leadership and being a good colleague was about helping. But if you do it to such a degree that you are helping rapidly or helping directly and helping in certain ways, there's a natural point that you're going to get overwhelmed. So what he did, and what I see really successful for a lot of people, he happened to use his calendar and email, but he was looking for devices that helped him say, not what's the 1 or 2 big things that I want to try to delegate, but where's the minutia accruing around me, right? The small things that I'm fighting through every day, and I just do it in the moment because it feels like the right thing to do, or there's a social history or whatever that's actually killing me, right? And so he was looking for, back 4 months. You can't look back last week or you'll justify everything. Look back 4 months. You're looking for routine informational requests that you could make an alternative person to go-to person on routine decisions, that you're not adding unique value, and portions of your role you can shift, right? And then when you're thinking about where it goes, what I'm always telling people is you don't think about your first 5, right? Maybe make that list of 5, but then say, okay, what's the second 5, right? And try to push those ideas out. And what you're doing is trying to take demands off the center in a way that this group won't fight you for, and use that to pull in talent, right? And domains that start to kind of create their capability has a fantastic effect, right? There's little tricks and trades to it, but it tends to be a really powerful kind of way to leverage them. So we got about 15% of his time back by looking at the small, right? Not the one big thing or the elegant solution. That's what everybody wants, but fighting on the small. And then he said, okay, what am I doing, right? How am I the enemy? And so the first piece was kind of structurally, right? If I think about structure in my role as information, decisions, portions of role, and shifting that in a way I can control. Second was about what do I need to do differently? And what would happen to Scott is he got in trouble because he loved to help. He wasn't controlling, right? And you'd meet him and you'd love him. But he would see these things, for example, evolve on email, where there may be 10, 15, 20 people copied on an email. Somebody would say we should go to A, and then somebody would say we should go to B, and somebody would say we should go to C. And then Scott would eventually come in, not with a directive order, but he would say, well, what about this? Right? And literally in a questioning order way, and just as a way to show his team that he was present. And what he couldn't see is then all of a sudden the team was managing the issue, and then they started thinking we've got to manage Scott. Right. And so he would end up with more emails back to him and meetings on his calendar and decision cycles that oftentimes were happening 4, 8, 12 weeks later. And he couldn't even remember that it was that small comment he made that put him in that spot 4, 12, 8 weeks later that was driving the overload. And I see this so much more frequently than I ever expected. Right. There are these small moments that we tend to jump that come back at us in a way that our minds can't quite even recall that we started it. To begin with. So they did with him, what I didn't know was possible, because all he was trying to do was show he was present, right? He just wanted his team to know he was there, right? Not even, caring about what he was suggesting, but it was causing him trouble. And he knew he was doing it, but he couldn't stop himself. So they sent him to a health retreat camp out in the woods. So he was physically unhealthy. He wasn't doing well, but they had him, go into this camp for 10 days, and it was a yoga meditation. There was recreational meditation coming, and kind of positive things from a health standpoint. And he said the hardest part about it, when he presents this with me in this organization, was that when he walked in the door, they took away his devices, right? And I mean that plural. He had 2 of them. He was constantly checking, and he described it like a heroin withdrawal, like the first day. And we know that's probably not too far off the truth, right? Because of the hits we get every time we're checking. But he got through the 10 days, and on day 11 or somewhere around that, he was back in the office going through all the emails. And for him, the biggest insight was he saw this trail, evolving. This was 10 days ago, this issue was happening, and he viscerally felt his body reacting, right? He was like, I need to let my team know I'm here, right? Viscerally felt it. And then he would see 3 emails after he would have jumped in that it was solved, right? Fine without him. But for him, it was like a real eye opener about the degree to which how and when he jumped in was coming back to him in ways that he couldn't see. Right. And so there's certain things he did on that front as well. And he moved over the course of about a year from number 1 overloaded person to 17 and then to 23 by virtue of thinking about these 2 ideas. One is, how am I defining or playing offense on the structure of interactions that I'm in? I'm not somebody else's idea of fun, but I'm actually shaping it so that I'm having the optimal impact. And then number 2, behaviorally, what am I doing that's causing the problem that I can adapt? And that's what I'd love to poll everybody on. I'd love to kind of take a moment. If we look across what's ultimately been over 800 interviews I've done around this work for the overload side and then the positive side, if we look at the common things that people say have the greatest impact structurally, right, it tends to be clarity on capabilities they want to live, certainly blocking reflective time, strategically calendaring time for connections that are going to pull you into kind of work you want to do, reviewing calendar, like I'm describing here, whatever devices that help you isolate out a couple of the smaller elements that you can either shift away from, you stop going to, whatever it may be. But I'd love to just do a quick poll here and ask people, if you can, if you were to do one of these things, right, that could have the biggest impact for you, not which one do you do well, but if you were going to do one of these things could have the biggest impact, what might that be? So Stella, I think I'm going to turn it to you here if we can. All right, thank you. So I'll give you about 60 seconds. I know these are long, but they're going to line up with something that I'm going to pass on to people as well.
And I assume this is multiple choice questions, so please choose one.
Yeah. Oh, that's, yeah. Pick one. But you got to pick, because I know where you live.
And Rob, while folks are filling that out, we have had some very good questions in the chat come across. To start, we do have a spectrum of folks on the call. And I think fundamentally people are curious about the data sources that you're referring to here, both in these studies, but just generally what companies are using, and maybe just like a quick 20-30 second sort of overview of your thoughts on the different approaches to that.
Yep. So, I mean, just broadly speaking, the data sources tend to fall into two camps. One is what people will call passive analytics, and they're leveraging things like email. They're not opening the emails and they're aggregating them up, but they're looking at the send and respond, right, to see the patterns of interaction, or IMs, or calendaring data, or all sorts of other things, right? There's relational elements and a ton of things in the world that you can start to mine, right, in that sense. And there's tremendous strength in that, particularly if the problem you're trying to solve occurs over time. So let's say that I'm really trying to stop attrition, right? And I really want to understand where are people leaving because they're getting overwhelmed at a certain point. Well, the passive analytics are superb for that, right? Because you can track and see things in increments. The other is more active, and those are more survey-based approaches. And so those tend to really have great strengths if you're trying to drive an organizational change, if you really need to understand the quality of the tie. Right. So the problem with passive a lot of times is you don't know if the 5 emails Bennett and I have exchanged have been something good or each other ridiculing each other, whatever it may be. We don't know what's happening in that. With a survey, we can at least get a sense of a qualitative assessment of the value of somebody else, or if they're an energizer to me, or things like that. So that's broadly speaking, the different data sources in there. There are on my website at robcross.org, there's a ton of little tutorials, and we also offer a free course, access to some of the free software, as well as some other things on this that I would point people to. All right, so I'm going to end the poll. Who's going to, or Sal, do you want to end it, or should I end it, or what do we do here? You're gonna end it. Okay, good deal. So there's a couple of things that I'm gonna grab here. So I'll just pick one. I'll pick the block time one. In this case, is one of the leading vote getters. And I will say the clarity one, what's really cool is that one's associated with the happiest people. When we look at everybody that's come through the analytics, the people that do that better tend to I say happy, but we've been measuring it as thriving, resilience, engagement, career satisfaction, psychological well-being, tons of things. And that clarity tends to be, one of the big things. The block time is important because it gets to this idea that it's not just the volume of the demands that are killing us, but it's the diversity of them, right? And so we know that the act of looking down at a text and back up is as much as a 64-second loss for people. We don't experience it. We tell ourselves a story that gets us back on track. If we allow that distraction to be something that we lose our train of thought, what the psychologists call a schema, then the recovery time can be as much as 20-23 minutes to fully get back to where we were. And so you just, do a little calculus in your own day-to-day life and say, well, how much of the small ones do I allow to happen? Because I'm on Slack, I'm on the team space, allow IMs to come across my phone, whatever it may be. And do I have 1 or 2 big ones, right, through the day? And that adds up, right? An hour or 2 in the night that you have to find time to get that reflective space. And what we can see, the work we did with, for example, Uber and General Mills, RJ and Mike Benson, Jack Costel, was showing that a 2-hour block is optimal from a productivity standpoint. And Microsoft has evidence that an hour and a half it kind of depends on the nature of the work. And that it wasn't enough to tell people this, but what really RJ found effective is building an app that helped people structure their time against that. Right, so it actually helped manipulate the time on the calendar and reset appointments so that people could kind of preserve that. And that's a really interesting thought for me about, it's not just the analytic insight that matters. And hopefully, I'm sure that many of you guys know this, it's how do you get it into play, right? That's the bigger and bigger deal. And so what I found in the interviews, though, when I went through all of this, is the people that would do really well, they were really clear on a rhythm of work that worked for them. So I would talk to the first person and they would say, gosh, the first thing I do is email, right? Get that out of the way, then I can go on with my life. And I would think, okay, that's a good idea. And I'd say, well, next person, do you do email? And they would look at me and they say, have you lost your mind? If I start with email, I'll never get off email. And for me, it's, I'm going to be creative first, and then I'm going to do email in 30-minute blocks, maybe 3 times through the day. I'm going to tell other people what I'm doing. And you'd be amazed how much life evolves around me, right? When I put that structure into place and I'm able to kind of work a little bit better. And so that's kind of what I see, right, in this, is that the people that are putting structure in do better. Last thing I'll say is, you notice we didn't get we got a couple of leading contenders with 8 votes each, but no item in here got 32, right, or 33. And that's a little bit of the point, where all I ever get, even sessions like this, people will end it and say, Rob, tell me the one thing that people, should know. And it's just not that game, right? It's a game of figuring out what are the 3 or so things in these categories that you need to delve down to. And so the first is on, let me close this out, on structure, right? How are we putting that in? The second is then around these triggers that I'll call. And what I could see with the overload is people would tend to get in trouble in 2 ways. One is when surges of work happened and either a big project landed on them or they were promoted and they had to figure out how to collaborate fundamentally differently. And those were less problematic to me because there was kind of a defined starting point and hopefully an end point that they were working through. What I got more stressed about was when the overload crept around people, what I would call a slow burn, and they just kept trying to work a little more incrementally faster, right? We moved from the hour meetings to the 30-minute ones. We're working deeper into the night. We're adapting the next technology that's going to help us get a little bit quicker, but what it's doing is driving stuff back to us even more quickly. And people would be at this for quite some time and then have some stark wake-up moment. And the challenge in it is, and the insidious thing about collaborative overload is it feels good until it doesn't, right? Because we're in the thick of things, we're jumping in Scott's case in ways that he felt good about because it was helping others. And there's an energy, right? And a frenzy around you right up until it doesn't feel good. You know, your significant other says no more through the weekend, you lose a key employee, that last, you know, move, one train stop out, right, is the last straw that kind of brings people down. I would hear these stories over and over again, right, of people that kind of hit these threshold points, all great right up until it wasn't. And what I could see that was driving that were these triggers, right? And so one, we talked about one already, Scott's desire to help, turns out to be, you know, hugely prominent in the people that get overwhelmed, not micromanaging, not controlling, not people you tell to go delegate, but people that are just trying to be helpful. They see being a good colleague as somebody that jumps in and helps, being a good leader, somebody that's removing obstacles quickly, and the way you do it, right, can cause you problems. For me, it's this first one here. It's accomplishment, right? If I see 5 minutes of space, I'm going to try to jam 60 minutes of stuff in it, and I'm going to completely ignore the 3 hours of emails and phone calls and everything I have to do to get everybody else on board. And then I'm really irritated 6 weeks out when people are not doing what I told them to do. And I started it, right, at the end of the day. And it has taken me forever to begin to see that. Right. And you can go down the list and you can see for some people it's status, right? They were this kind of academic expert that mattered 5 years ago, but by God, they're going to hold on to that, or their scientific base or whatever, and the way they interject that comes in. For some, it's fear, right? And for many, it's fear of what their colleagues might think. And the day they figure out that the word no doesn't have to be binary, right? You can kind of allow people to see what you're doing, what you're struggling with, and make decisions together. They talk about it as a highly liberating moment, right? Because it wasn't fear that was driving them to say yes all the time. So let's pull this one more time, and we'll do the same thing, give you about 60 seconds. If we can open the poll here. And I'd just be curious, you know, what's the thing you're triggered, right? Either something you see in yourself, or if you just think about leaders, right, in general, or people in general in your organization where this happens. I'd love to just get a sense of that. And then I'll push ahead and show one or two of the tools that we've done and some couple of quick ideas.
Rob, is this also single choice? Because it's set up as multiple choice.
Yeah, people always say, can I have more than one? Yeah, the idea should be one for now. I say, just get one there. Okay. But you guys can do whatever you want. And Bennett, I don't know if there's another question you have there. I can jump in.
Definitely. So this one is focusing on the idea of total network impact on maybe this work or some of the work generally that you completed over the years. So, for example, the Mitchells of the world, when they leave the company, mm-hmm. how do you or what sorts of work do you do to look at the whole network picture? How does culture change, or you know, how do networks change and adapt to shocks that may happen? Pandemic may be a good example of that. Shift to hybrid work. Right. What are some favorite projects there, or some kind of hard-hitting ones that you'd like to highlight?
Right. So, I mean, so one, I'll just tie off with the this HBR that is out right now. People can look at that, and it actually cites a website called connectedtalent.com. That's something we built for the consortium members that had really invested a ton of effort in this work. You can get a sense of how much I really cherish these members, because it's not just the quantitative analytics that they're giving me, but if you've been tracking, I've been talking about 800 interviews ultimately that we've done over the trajectory of this work. And so that means everybody is finding 5 of their most successful women, 5 of their most successful men to talk to the flaky academic, right? And it's a huge effort. And so what we did with that one is I started really pushing economically to say, what's the cost of losing somebody, right, in these organizations? And what I hear, and I'm not an HR person or an HR analytics person, but what I hear a lot of is that people calculate that cost based on the cost of acquisition, right? And it's the recruiting costs or other things like that. Maybe they throw in a little bit more. And that dramatically underestimates the cost of losing certain people, and the ability, if you could streamline their entry, right, differently, right? Move that number from 3 to 5 years to 9 to 12 months. You decrease the odds of attrition, you get productivity more quickly. And even just this basic idea of when Bennett leaves, right? If let's just say 5 people and you've made their lives 5% harder, right, by your departure for 6 months, 3 months to find somebody, 3 months for us to get used to them, and you start applying the cost of that, right? And so the economics are really significant and they're poorly understood, you know. And of course, people will say, well, that cost doesn't accrue to our bottom line. And you're like, well, it does. There's a reason people are so stressed out right now. It's because we're not really thinking about that. So on that website, it's a calculator I built, and it looks surface, but what's behind it are these massive spreadsheets and analytics that we've done for some time. And so when you just talk about the network effect, right, that's one idea, right, of being able to see kind of these transitions, you know, in different ways. And so Stella, should we take this one? Are we good? And then let me get on my horse and ride here to make sure I hit on the 7 o'clock stopping point. So the what you see again, two kind of big spikes here, right? Desire to help, and again, it shows out in certain sectors more prominently, like healthcare, things like that. But it's a much bigger driver of overload. Like typically, and I bet if I'd ask people coming into this, what do you think is the biggest driver of overload? People would say, well, they're control freaks, right? Or they're micromanagers. And we find that this desire to help is huge. The sense of fulfillment. I mean, people are just, and none of this is bad, right? Accomplishment's a great thing, but when it leads to, you know, these quick decisions, it can cause problems. And so what I'm always gearing people towards, and the toolkit that you'll see, is getting to the awareness of that trigger and then a heuristic. So for the sense, the desire to help, right? People, the heuristics I'll hear people talk about is just having in their mind, saying yes means saying no, right? And so when they're in a situation and they're about to jump in, they're trying to kind of really guard themselves against what's this going to take me away from, both professionally and personally, right? In different ways. And that tends to be, you know, one way, right? Of kind of thinking about this. So let me show you one thing. So when we look at this, and I wanted to kind of dive down because, you know, hopefully you're getting a sense of the way we find these people analytically, and then how we're using the interviews to say what's causing this and what are people doing to get out of it. And we find that there's 3 categories of things, right? As I said, about putting structure in, challenging these triggers, and then purely tactically, you find the more efficient collaborators, they use email differently, right? They run meetings differently. It's a whole set of things about how they're working. But I don't like to start with that. Those are the tactical items. I find if I start with that, then people just take those on and they tend to move faster. So, and not necessarily better, right? Kind of like the 8 meetings to 16 idea. So what we do with this in the Commons is try to figure out a whole slew of different ways to get these insights into practice. So on that HBR that we were talking about earlier, for example, if I know over the course of 9 months what kinds of connections people need and what they need to be doing, not just in the first 30 days or 90 days, but really 9 months to kind of get through a certain window of time that increases the odds they stay, then we can feed that up to them, right? We can create small tools, small guides that says, this is the set of connections at this point in time that's important. And we don't just give it to the person, we give it to the person and to their leader. Right, so it spurs a conversation where the 2 of them are sitting down and saying, how can I help, right? And it embeds that behavior you're looking for in the relationship. We have much greater success, right? By virtue of kind of doing that and how we're feeding in the analytics. This is a simple idea around the overload stuff that has taken off like crazy. The members are just loving. I've played with this in different ways, but it's a simple card sort that has these same behaviors that you've seen me talk about. You know, 8 around how do you put structure into your world, 9 around how do you challenge these triggers, right? What are 1 or 2 that cause you trouble? And then, you know, 8 around certain behaviors that we see of the more efficient collaborators. And so people can go through this thing and say, gosh, you know, what do I most need to do? Maybe it's block reflective time. They can flip that card over. They get a little bit more depth on, okay, here's what this thing is, why it matters. And then each of these has a roughly 3-minute video associated with it. That was me in a green room right now, but we're working because of the digital nature of the assets to get greater diversity and different backdrops and other things into it. But each of these stories is around, here's why this thing matters today. Here's a story of somebody that does this well and what they're doing so people can get insights. And here's 4 things you could do. Right. And so it's not trying to say, here's what you have to do, but given the context, you kind of pick a couple of things and you go about it. Right. So what people are doing, give me a little bit of time on this, and they're trying to isolate out what's the 1 or 2 things that I most need to pay attention to. Right. Or what are the triggers in this case that are driving me to be potentially overloaded and causing me problems? Maybe it's desire to help. I'll grab that one since we were voted on that one. I'll grab the fear of missing out too. That tends to be a big one. And then let's say it's behaviorally, you know, what do I most need to be thinking about in terms of how I'm doing things? I'll just grab the efficiency behaviors as one. And people go through this and then they can submit, and it creates you have the ability to generate a personalized report, right, for yourself off of this. So this is just taken the 4 cards, right, that I just pulled right here around here's what Rob, you know, in this case needs to go do. And then it's each of these cards has a page behind it around here's what this thing is and a little bit greater depth on what you can do, why it matters. It's got a case study again with somebody else that's kind of talking about what they're doing, another video, and people are using this in different ways, right? It can be in kind of leadership forums. They can disaggregate this and give this as feeds if they've actually done the analytics and they see people are overwhelmed. There's different ways that can be fed up. But the idea is really trying to kind of get the recommendation content down, to a certain granularity that helps people to be able to take action. So this is one thing that, depending on the nature of your audience, we may use the online diagnostics, or if it's more people that like kind of the graphics and the whirls and stuff like that, we may kind of go down the route of the online tools. So let me wrap here. I'll kind of comment on the other side of this infinity loop at a super high level. And so I'm going to kind of bounce ahead a little bit and just ask you to ignore what I'm doing here, but I want to make sure I end on 7 and kind of finish with some time here. But what I could see in the work is the first thing people are doing is they're doing things that enable them to buy time back. And then when they're investing that time, what was interesting to me is number one, and this is for the diverse network piece, we have known for a long, long time, worked since Ron Burt in the 70s, and a lot of other people have found this, that it's never the size of the network that predicts the high performers. It's the more diverse networks, right? More bridging ties into different pockets of an organization, outside an organization. And the idea is, for the same investment of time, these people get a greater impact from their networks. They see their problems differently, right? They're more innovative, and it tends to be predictive of a lot of things. My work, I've seen it's the second biggest predictor of a high performer as anything else we've seen over time, right? But it leaves you with a hell of a question, like, what do you tell busy people, right? Do you go back and say, just go meet a lot of people that are different, right? Good luck with that. And so I spent a lot of time talking to people about, tell me about a career-defining accomplishment, right? Something that put you on your upwardly mobile path. And I would specifically say, I could care less what you did, right, in this situation. I don't want to understand the behaviors and what you think you did to save the day. What I really want to understand is the role of the network. Like, what were the interactions that helped you see this possibility? What were those that helped you fill skill gaps because you didn't know everything about this area? What helped you scale, et cetera? And what we learned in that is a lot of nuance that's really, put into this chapter 6 in the book. But just at a high level, we saw that the more successful people, they spend about 20 to 25% more time exploring possibilities with others. So they'd be reaching out to different functional areas, different capability domains, different organizations. And it was not a form of networking, like a Granovetter kind of thing, saying, I need a job, right? It was a form of networking that was just saying, what's possible, right? If we were to collaborate in some way, what could happen? And they would create this awareness of capability that when an opportunity passed, they had a much better response than people that didn't do this, right? And so they literally see their problems differently, right? Their financial transactions or the consulting proposal or whatever, because they're not thinking about it just in terms of what they know, but these markers of how could we integrate what others know. And so they're winning, right? Second biggest predictor of a high performer. And to me, it's really cool. It's not access to some invisible power structure that some small set of people have. It's just the way that they're choosing to spend time that lets them produce a bigger outcome and then also build a better network, right? In that process, that's then bringing them opportunities. The second thing on here, this energy idea, is it turns out, across 23 years of doing this, I have yet to see something outpredict just this basic idea of the people that create enthusiasm in these networks. Generally it's about 4 times the predictor of a high performer as anything else we've seen. And so we've spent a huge amount of time kind of behind that, studying the energizers in these network and the energized to try and understand what's going on behaviorally, what is happening in these relationships that's creating enthusiasm. And it boils down, it's not personality, it's not extroversion or introversion per se. You're as likely to see somebody that's very low key, be your interviewee, somebody that's very charismatic, but it does boil down to a set of behaviors that we can see really distinguish those people that create enthusiasm in others. So this isn't, am I getting energy? Am I somebody that interacts in a way that other people get energized by what I'm up to, right? That matters. And so you look at this right side of the loop, and let me ask you a question intuitively. What do you think the first 2 things are you stop doing when you get collaboratively overwhelmed? I mean, just intuitively, right? You stop exploring and thinking expansively in small moments, and you certainly stop coming into interactions in ways that you're thinking about, how do I position this in a way that's going to engage others, right? And I mean that at work, and if you happen to have kids at home too, right? If I come in as dad and I've got 3 things to solve, by God, those are not the interactions that are great, right? Versus coming in and saying, kind of, how do I position this? How do I think about what's going to engage others? How do I take 50% of my one-on-one time and have it be off task, so I can shape the nature of work coming in a way that aligns better? And so hopefully you see a little bit of the interplay here, right? The people that buy back time, it's not just that they're meeting a ton of other people. This is a very different way of thinking about how they're generating success and scale. And if they do it well, though, then there's a reverse effect of being able to push back more, right? They're better able to kind of say no to things and prioritize kind of where they're investing time. So let me stop there. There's a little bit more that maybe I'll save for another shot. That's really kind of the work, especially that Jody and the team there have really supported in a huge way. And it's very heavily around well-being. And if we look at kind of how connections are having an impact on that front, but I want to make sure I'm mindful of time here. And this is actually the focus of the next book we've already signed. So maybe we can do this again in a year and then be kind of deeper down on that. So let me stop there, and Bennett, I'll turn it back to you if there's any questions or things like that you want me to prattle on.
Love it. Thank you, Rob. There's a real energy here in the chat and clamoring for resources. And you've mentioned one a little bit earlier in the presentation. I believe it was a team level assessment tool. I believe it was like it had some catchy URL. Could you remind us what that was?
So the one on what I call it's called connected talent. Like everybody in the comments needs some sort of term for these things. That's the one that's really focused on these, what I call the fast movers. And it's really a suite of resources that are focused on 4 kinds of transitions, right? It's the initial entry, it's the promotion, it's the lateral transitions for more agile base of work, and then senior entry. And so there's a lot there, and I think it's connectedtalent.com. It's in the HBR as a resource for people to go out to. There's another tool that I just didn't think we'd have time to kind of delve into today, but called the Agility Accelerator. That's a very rapid O&A tool that people are really loving, because what it does is people make a couple of decisions, they deploy the assessment. So it is a survey-based tool in this case, but once it goes out, it comes back and everything is formatted into a really cool dashboard. And what I love about it is it's not really deep analytics, right? It's what we've learned over 20 years that the executives need to see, right? So it's not eigenvector centrality or some clustering algorithm. It's really kind of the insights parsed up that way with the recommendation content built behind it. In the same way I'm showing you this stuff, right? It shows kind of, if you have this pattern, here's, all the interviews and 5 things you could do about it. So hopefully that helps. That's a couple things anyway.
Excellent. Yeah, these tools that I'm finding available through the Commons do generate quite a bit of buzz. And by the way, that's the connected Commons for everyone, again, on the call that might not be familiar, because they are quick to deploy, and they are, they get right to the pracademic insights very quickly. As I know as an ONA practitioner myself, how much time and energy can go into just a traditional survey-based organizational network analysis, or even spinning up what Rob was talking about earlier, a passive-based organizational network analysis. Do you have any general advice for people just to kind of pick and choose? Maybe it's a conversation with their head of talent or someone in terms of bringing in sort of these basic network insights into their talent managed philosophy, maybe some other areas of HR focused on well-being, and maybe that you could dovetail into that other work, Rob, on well-being, which is great there too.
I'd kill to if you guys want to. It's
absolutely, and we have plenty of time.
Okay,
it seems like folks are very engaged.
The things that people are grappling with, with me from an HR standpoint, are, certainly overload, right? People are burned out, they're stressed out, and it's a product of us not being able to really see and think about the collaborative footprint of work that we're asking of people today, right? And so thinking about how do you don't even really have to do the network analysis. Intuitively, your engagement surveys probably point you to your manager layers, right? And other places that this stress is kind of going through the roof. So that becomes then an easy way to say, we can do the analytics, and there are a lot of places that lean in that way, or we can just design a set of things around these cards and kind of team norming activities that start to pull that demand down, right, and diffuse it down in pretty cool ways. Certainly some of the stuff we've been doing with diversity, equity, and inclusion has been amazing to me. For 20 years, I've been able to get gender in this work. And so we can see some really cool things about things that distinguish women that are more successful in a conventional sense, right? Kind of getting to that upper echelon. The companies wouldn't give me ethnicity forever, right? They were constantly, the attorneys would say, no, no, no. And up until George Floyd, right? And all of a sudden we had 15, 20 companies that we had really rich O&A data in, and they were saying, okay, we need to look at this. And it's been amazing, like really, really cool. You don't see, when you look at it that way, this dominant population and everybody's marginalized. You see these pockets, particularly if you look at gender and ethnicity combined, with different exemplars, people that kind of manage to kind of engage quickly, right? In the same notion there. And so that's opening up a ton of really cool things. Like as an example, what a lot of places are doing with that is they're looking at implicit bias, right? Which we fundamentally know exists, right? Everybody does it, right? You look in that immediate knee-jerk reaction is for similarity. But unfortunately, what those studies leave you with the impression on is that you never change your mind, right? Because they're done in the labs, right? And it just kind of says, oh, well, once that decision's made, that never changes. Well, we know that's not true, right? I mean, if that were the true, these networks would be entirely men in one spot and women in the other, right? And nothing would kind of cross over. And what we could see in it was that the people that are really good at breaking that, they are engaging in ways that give others information that enable them to trust them more rapidly, right? So I know that sounds like a weird thing, but what I could see is they were really good at positioning their expertise to the incumbent's needs. They then didn't say, I can do that, right? Which is a blind spot we all have in trust. They would say, gosh, here's what I've done before. How is this relevant? Right. And so suddenly then people are looking and saying, not do I trust Rob, but that's, oh, hell, he's done this. What do we do with it? You know what I mean? And it's just that simple shift in kind of how I'm making information from a competence-based trust standpoint available. Then there's a dependability component and the benevolence-based trust, kind of getting off task tended to be the last cycle in there. So that to me is really cool, right? It's saying, well, here's not that implicit bias doesn't exist, but maybe, we can start to target behaviors that create this form of trust and create a dual accountability for it, right? For the individual and the other people. And maybe we'll see something cool. And I think we will, like from what I'm seeing and some of this out there. So that's a couple things, but there's like 20 others. And I see Nora with a hand up there. So I'll go there.
I'm trying to be patient.
Yeah.
I'm not very good at it. Rob, I love your research and I really resonate with everything you're saying. And I do a different angle on this work, but I do a lot of implementation around this work because I use a neuroscience and psychology based approach. And I find that the kind of common shared human story of like, we all come from tribe and we all have a computer running software we didn't install, right? In our heads is like a really easy way to liberate folks from shame and blame as they try new behaviors. What I'm hearing in your speaking at this moment, as you describe this particular phenomenon, which I've also observed, right? Which is that people do shift behavior, but they do it slowly and they do it with repetition and exposure and gentleness, not by fiat, right? As you're talking, what I'm struck by is how much this is sort of classic marketing, right? Like we're talking about early adopters, we're talking about brand exposure, right? How much are you, when you're talking through these strategies with your clients, with your research targets, how much are you kind of using their existing corporate frameworks for marketing to help them understand that that's actually how we change hearts and minds in every direction?
It's interesting. I don't think, what's interesting about being me is I'm always the boy with a hammer. I'm always like really deep in this device and then an inch deep in what I'm applying it to. And I kind of slowly build that out. But it's been really cool. It's kept me engaged for 23 years and I'm really passionate about this because I bump into people like yourself or others that are saying, here's kind of how this applies. So what I see that I loved about it is how you're saying, this kind of trust builds slowly, like and over time. And I think the real opportunity with this is watching people try to say, okay, if we structure the nature of these interactions, maybe it doesn't build as slowly, right? Maybe we can actually speed the nature of it just by virtue of being a little bit more intentional, you know what I mean?
Right.
Not manipulative.
A little gamification, a little dashboard. Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
So that's been super cool. And there's a lot of kind of things kind of popping out of the diversity, equity, inclusion idea, right? That's there. And then on the well-being, and then I'll stop and we can take other, kind of thoughts and questions in there. And this is really, with Jody and the community there that sponsored this work. We really leaned in heavily to a lot of the members of the consortium were coming back to me and saying, Rob, we love what you're doing with the performance dimension, but what we'd really also like to understand are happy people, right? And I mean that kind of tongue in cheek because we were measuring it, as I said earlier, psychological well-being, thriving, resilience, engagement, career satisfaction, just a ton of different ways. But the idea was to put the relationship as central to people's experience of well-being, which is not new in the sense that if you look at most models of what creates a happy person, relationships are always there, right?
Number
But
one.
it's the most underexplored piece of the model. It's always like, well, if you don't have them, you're in trouble, right? Or if you know, and it never says like, well, how do these people build them? What do they get out of them? What happens if you fall out of groups because you're busy late 30s and you fell out of things, right? And you got to get back in to save your life. And so that was really kind of the heart of this work that we were really focused on, is if you put relationships as central, we can see in terms of the way we're looking at well-being, and this isn't all components of it, but we see they have a dramatically significant and predictable impact on people's physical health, right? If they make decisions to get healthier, on their experience of growth in and out of their organizations, on how they experience purpose, both in and out of work, and then on resilience. So resilience is one of those examples that there are certain schools of thought that it's an internal thing. It's grit, it's fortitude, it's that sort of thing. But if you do these interviews, and they've done over 300 of them now, where you're talking to people, how did you get through a difficult stretch in your life? You find that they fall back on others in 8 really predictable ways if they have the relationships, right? For perspective, for empathy, for seeing a path forward, just to laugh at the absurdity of the situation you're in, and these things matter. They're a resource if people have engaged in their life in a way that that leads them to be there. But the story I'll tell you, and then I'll stop, is so I'm on the first interview of these, like out of several hundred, right? And it was a life science executive in London, lovely British accent, and she was saying to me, Rob, I was the person in high school that dodged gym, right? Anything I could do to get out of PE, that's what I did. And she then, was very successful, right, in her career. But she said she hit her kind of mid to late 30s, and her doctor gave her a pretty stern warning, right, and said, you need to kind of do something. And so she started walking around a park, right, in London. And it just happened that she started bumping into some other people that were walking at the same time. And so they would start to walk together and talk. And the initial walks led to, slightly longer walks, and then a charity run. And then you flash forward to 10 years when I'm talking to her, and she's saying, well, now I go on vacations with my husband where we're planning them around marathons we run in these cities, and you're like, and this is the person that dodged gym in high school. And so you imagine like and what she said, there's 2 things that are worth taking away and holding on to. One is it wasn't the activity, right? The running gave identity that created a way to push work back, right? To kind of make time for it. But it was the people around it that really mattered, right? It was the authenticity. They saw her at her worst. She saw them at their worst. They were not just life science executives. There was a male person, an IT person. They saw life differently, right? And it was those interactions and authentic connections that created a different dimension of her life, right? And if I had one idea that I can see with the happy people, is that they have typically at least 2 and usually 3 groups like that keeps work in perspective, right? Keeps the stress from building up in crazy ways. And of course, that's what we've lost in COVID, right? It's not just the demand that's gone up, it's that we've been pulled out of these groups that helped us ameliorate it. And so with this interview, like 45 minutes in, I was laughing, joking, this is great. I'm thinking if I get a couple hundred more of these, life is perfect. And then I just stopped on a whim and I said, well, what got you in trouble, right, to begin with? And it went from like this real high energy to like nothing. And she just sat there for a second and she said, well, just life, I guess, eventually. And that led me to really explore that, right, for a second. And what it has really evolved over hundreds of these interviews, again, is what I'm calling micro stresses. And it's just the way stress comes at us today through all these relational touch points, right? And they're all small. You sense misalignment with a colleague on a video call. You see a team member that needs to be coached for the 3rd time, and you're wondering, how am I going to convey that message? You get a text from a child that you can't tell if it's a big deal or something they're over in 5 seconds, but you worry about for 3 hours. All these things you just fight through. But there's such a velocity and magnitude today because of these collaborative technologies, both work and home, that we go through 25, 30 more of these, we go home exhausted, and we can't put our finger on what happened anymore, right? Because it's not one big source of stress. It's multiple accumulated small, and many of them from people we love, at the heart of it. And so that's, we've really been focused, that's the heart of the next book, right? Is to really say, there's systematic drivers of this, and there are ways of dealing with it. And we can see some people, just like I could with the performance piece, here we can see some people are doing it much better, right? And they're handling that in a very, very different way. Key, like that's half of my advice to people, especially you get to these people that are kind of, and again, it happens typically late 30s. We can see it, they're falling out of groups because work and then suddenly home is taken off. And they can't figure out how to get back in, right? They've lost the tennis skills that kept them where they were, or other things like that. And so I've got my own strategies, but I'd love to compare notes. So you'll hear from me.
Can't wait for that, Rob. We're almost at the end of the question queue. There is one, it's a shift in gears, and we do have time perhaps for one or two others if you're game for that, Rob. And this is really, I think, targeted at folks that work in multinational companies that are focusing on bridging ties between different cultural groupings. So, that could be between countries or in, and I think we do mean that in an international sense, but even within countries with different cultural groups as well. What have you found sort of headline research wise, through your 20 years of experience working through those types of barriers or spanning those types of boundaries?
Yeah, so I mean, some of the strategies that we see, is if you're using the analytics, then you can start to be able to see who are the best people to try and invest time in creating connections. Like, I'm just going to grab it and say, gosh, you're trying to better integrate New York, London, and Singapore, right? If you're in the banking sector, right? And so if you can start to see that, and this is a really cool use of the passive analytics too, that you can then think about, how do I staff people on projects together, right? You take the well-connected people on either side, and whatever the unit of work is you have to leverage, you bring them together and they kind of bring their connections, right? And so it tends to be an efficient way to do that. I'm working a lot right now with a guy named Aaron Hurst, who wrote about the purpose economy, and he has this interesting platform called Imperative that structures conversations that help people get down to understanding kind of how they see a sense of purpose in their lives and work, right? So it's more sophisticated than that. I'm not doing it justice in this quick call. But the magic of what we're doing together is, if I can go back, in a conversation like what you're talking about, then I can say, if you're going to invest in building 50 connections, right? So 100 people, 50 connections, I can go back and say, here's the ones to do, right? That if you can create, kind of mutual respect and purpose across those people, they're the ones that are most likely going to help you start to integrate, at points that you care about. So I think that's, one idea, and there's 1,000 others, right? If you're a consulting firm, you start staffing projects differently. You do rotation programs. If you're in charge of leadership programs, think about how you're bringing those cohorts together, right? And we see huge payback if they do that well, and then go back to their home offices and they're referencing those connections. But at the heart of it, to me, that's kind of it, right? As you think about the analytics that then help inform what's the optimal use of the experience, or whatever unit you're trying to go after. And I think you're on mute, man. Maybe 2 more years in the pandemic.
I was just kidding, things escalated.
Right.
I was yelling at my iPad. So thanks, Rob. So I will open up the floor just for any more audio based questions, just for a moment. And if not, I will say thank you so much, Rob, Jody, for setting the stage for us tonight. It's just so great to see. This is a science, and it's a topic that a lot of companies want to get into now. A lot of us as beginning practitioners getting into this space had a lot of questions of, and you showed us sort of soup to nuts how data can be collected and really put into practice and make people's lives better, not just business outcomes. So really meaningful stuff. Thank you.